Although it doesn't look like it, with this atmospheric river going on here in our Pacific Northwest garden, it's still time to get the summer crops in the ground. I'm getting tomato starts from pots, my red solo cups and little pots in the ground, and you can see more about that in my last video that I posted, how to plant scraggly tomatoes. I'm also posting some peppers and eggplants in the ground. On those though, I'm not burying the stem like I did with the tomatoes, so I don't have to dig as big of a hole. It's a little bit faster to plant those eggplants and peppers for me than it is to do the tomatoes. The other kind of starts that I've been putting in the ground are squash, starting with the winter squashes. That includes things like kabochas, butternut, and sweetmeat. Also in the winter squash family, I'm planting pumpkin starts. I've got them going in my traditional pumpkin patch that I've grown pumpkins in that same place for several years now, and that's where I'm growing the peas currently. I have the peas growing in there in that same patch, and that's also where I'm planting cucumbers to see how they do growing up the same trellis that the peas have been using. I haven't grown cucumbers outdoors before. Last year was my first year growing cucumbers, and I grew them in the greenhouse. I grew them there thinking they needed a lot of heat, but I think they got overheated. So I'm excited to see how they fare with the space outside and being able to climb up that trellis, having a lot of space and not as hot as inside the greenhouse. Finally, in the category of squashes, I'm planting summer squash, a few zucchinis, and some yellow summer squash. Well, given that it looks like June around here will not consistently break into the 70-degree temperatures, I'm going to continue my practice from prior years of growing my melons in pots and putting them in the greenhouse. There they have the most possibility of getting the heat that they love. I've planted pole beans in cell trays and corn in red solo cups, and I'm a little bit behind on that, so I wanted to ensure quick germination. So I did put those in the warmth of my basement nursery, and I'm also keeping the seeds away from squirrels and birds by doing it that way. I'll transplant those from there into these beds shortly as soon as they germinate and there's a little bit of a plant there. That way I don't have too much root that I disturb in the process. I've done this before, so I know it's okay. I've also reseeded my zinnias. I reseeded about 6 trays of zinnias. My first batch, planted from a couple of months ago, didn't go so well. There was just too much time in the basement nursery without being potted up. It caused me to lose about half of those trays of zinnias, and that's because they were just drying out too quickly. I didn't water them on time, and I was getting a lot of pest pressure because they were just stressed out. So I lost about half of them. And I have yet to plant bush beans and edamame, the soybean, yet, but I'm going to, and they're going to be quicker, so I can still procrastinate on that a little bit while I get other things done around here. I'll start them in cell trays as well, for the same reason that I start my pole beans in trays, to keep them away from the birds and the squirrels and things like that. I will still have lots of flowers to put in the ground as well. Out there in the greenhouse and the outdoor nursery, I've still got a lot going on, so I'm definitely staying busy with everything that we have to plant. And once I get through all that, well, it's actually now time to start planting seeds for the fall garden. Hey, so I don't know if you're like me, you kind of know the need for keeping a garden journal for taking notes, but I'm not that disciplined at it. I've tried several rounds of doing it in different ways to try to increase how the ease of doing it. But I just had a light bulb moment because I make these videos, plus I also have the same need that the rest of us gardeners do in terms of creating a journal of what I planted where and what's going on. And so I was thinking, well, I usually only snap a video, so to speak, when it's something I think that I might edit into one of these episodes for YouTube. But why do I have to be so restrictive, right? I can snap a video on everything that I'm doing, and that can serve as my journal, so to speak. You know, when I plant something and I want to remember that I planted that in that particular area, which is a problem for me. Like onions, I'll plant onions all over the place, and remembering which onions I planted in which area has been a challenge this year. So if I just snap a video on it, make that my journal, then I've got two things done, right? Like I've created that video, it's in the library. If I think it would be of interest to you all to put in one of my episodes, then I can do that. I can edit it in. But even if it's not, I have that for my journal. So I'm excited about this idea. I love workflows that have multiple purposes to them, or can kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. And so, yeah, I'm excited to give that a shot. Here's what we started this week. From seed, pole beans, corn, and zinnias. Then in the ground, we planted the tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, summer squash like zucchini and yellow summer squash, winter squash like butternut and kabochas, and the Halloween pumpkins, cucumbers, and sunflowers. And here was our harvest this week: radishes, leeks and spring onions, beets and beet greens, kale, and a whole lot of spinach and lettuce. Well, I'm standing in the greenhouse to get out of the rain for a minute here. We're facing just this onslaught of rain, but you know, the wet doesn't bother me as much as just the temperatures, the cold, and what that means for the plants in the growing season. So here at our garden and PDX Garden Home, as we go into this next week, which heads us into mid-June, we are not getting into the 70s. We're back down into the 60s. We hit 70s a week ago, and now we're back down into the 60s. And even today is below 60s in the daytime temperatures. And then at night, we're actually dipping below the 50-degree mark. And so that's not great news for my tomatoes and peppers. Now, the consolation could be that while the air temperature might be dipping below 50, the ground temperature could still be a little bit warmer. But with all this cloud cover and rain, I'm not sure if that's going to be the case either. You know, certainly you could test it, but that's not my style. I just kind of just wing it as I go here. But in any case, it reminds me a little bit there, you know, Steve Solomon, a lot of us are facing this in the Pacific Northwest, and many of us have probably read, or if you haven't read, look up Steve Solomon. He wrote a book called Gardening West of the Cascades and a couple other books, and has a lot of good wisdom from his years and years of gardening that he did in our area. And one of the things I remember a line in there, and I may not be getting exactly right, but there was something unto, sometimes you have, you know, tomato and pepper years, and sometimes you have a cabbage year. And so I'm not ready to call it and say that this is a cabbage year, but it might be. The good news for me on that front, and for us here at PDX Garden Home, is we have a ton of backup broccoli starts. So if this is a cabbage year, I'm in position to pivot into planting more broccolis and cabbages and things like that could actually do better in this kind of weather. I've mentioned it before, the real burn is not to me, yeah, yes, I would love to get more of the hot weather crops in the summer, more of the tomatoes and peppers and the squashes and things like that. But the real burn to me is when it's inconsistent, right? Because the problem, you know, I love, as you've probably seen in my prior videos, I love planting like the Asian veggies like bok choys, and I also love planting spinach and of course lettuces and things like that. Well, the spinach and the bok choy and stuff like that, I could plant it. I could assume that the weather's going to kind of continue in this way, and I could plant it and try to extend that season. But then if we hit a hot day, then it bolts and it was all for nothing. So yeah, that, you know, it's, the inconsistency is worse than just knowing that, hey, we're going to have a cabbage year. I mean, if it's just consistently low temps, I can deal with that. I'm positioned to deal with that. But having it be low and then having it jump up high and stuff like that, that is hard to deal with for any type of veggie gardening that I might try to do here.